A racist police officer violently attacks an elderly black woman, but when he discovers who she really is, his reaction of surprise and regret is unexpected. The siren of the police cruiser echoed through the bustling streets of the city, slicing through the dense air of a hot afternoon. Julio Medeiros felt the weight of his badge in his pocket, but what weighed even heavier was the anticipation of what was to come. He and his partner, Sergeant Almeida, advanced into a predominantly black neighborhood where shouts and chaos mingled with the scent of smoke and adrenaline. The urgency of the call pulsed in Julio's veins, but something inside him twisted, an intuition he couldn't ignore. "Let's go, Julio. It's expected that we control the situation," said Almeida, with a confident look trying to convey assurance. But Julio had seen too much to believe things would be straightforward. As they approached the scene, the tension between the police and the residents became palpable. Faces full of anger and fear watched their every move with suspicion. As they disembarked, Julio spotted a crowd surrounding a small house. He heard the shouts before he saw the scene, an elderly woman being pushed, her hands raised in a gesture of resistance. Blood rushed to Julio's head. "It's her," he thought, but he wasn't sure. The police instinct screamed at him to act, and he leaped into the fray. Step back," he shouted, moving quickly toward the woman. When he got closer, what he saw made him hesitate. An elderly woman, gray hair and skin marked by time, who refused to be intimidated by the aggression. "I'm not a criminal," she exclaimed, her voice firm despite the situation. Julio felt a knot in his throat, but adrenaline drove him to act. "You need to calm down, ma'am," he ordered, but his voice sounded more like a command than a request. The woman, Maria das Graças, met his gaze with a challenging look. "Who do you think you are? A kid with a badge?" she replied, dignity radiating from her words. In that moment, Julio saw not just an elderly woman, but someone fighting for her dignity, and it destabilized him. Without thinking, he lunged forward and grabbed Maria's arm, trying to contain the situation. But the force he used was excessive. "You can't touch me!" she shouted, trying to break free. The crack of her voice echoed in Julio like a painful reminder that he was crossing a line. He felt the pressure mount around him, the stares of the residents fixed on him, some with disappointment, others with indignation. "Julio, calm down," Almeida warned him, but pride and anger clouded his judgment. The scene became a blur of shouts and pushes, as Julio, in a moment of loss of control, used unnecessary force to restrain Maria. Her face contorted in pain and indignation. "You can't do this," she protested, but her words seemed to vanish in the air. Eventually, the situation was brought under control, but what should have been a moment of triumph turned into a chasm of discomfort. After Maria was taken to the cruiser, Julio returned to the department, his chest puffed with a confusing pride. He had controlled the situation, but something inside him churned, an uncomfortable feeling he couldn't ignore. "Good job, partner," Almeida said, giving him a pat on the back. But the gesture brought no comfort. Julio sat at his desk, head full of questions and an echoing reminder of Maria's words, challenging him to see beyond his uniform. It was only the beginning of a journey that would change everything he knew about himself and the truth of the world he lived in. Julio received a call from his adoptive mother, Ana, while sitting at his desk in the police department. The phone's sound cut through the monotony of the afternoon, and he answered without much enthusiasm. Ana's voice came through the line, tense and hurried. "Julio, you need to come to the hospital. Your grandmother Maria, she's been hospitalized. The situation is serious." Those words hit Julio like a punch to the gut. He knew that Maria, the woman he had attacked without a second thought, was his biological grandmother. But the idea of visiting her now, after the brutality he had inflicted, seemed almost unbearable. Hesitation took hold of him and he fell silent, unsure how to respond. "Julio, are you still there?" Ana asked, her voice tinged with worry. I'll go," he finally replied, his voice slightly lower than he intended. "I'm on my way." Upon arriving at the hospital, Julio felt a knot form in his throat. The smell of disinfectant and the cold light of the hallways made him uneasy. He walked slowly, each step bringing him closer to a reality he didn't want to face. When he entered the room, he found Maria lying there, seemingly unconscious, connected to various monitors that beeped softly. Julio's heart tightened at the sight of the woman he had treated as a criminal, now vulnerable and frail. He approached her, and as he looked at her, he noticed a small bedside table. One object caught his attention, an old framed photo. Curious, he picked up the frame and examined it. The image showed a young woman with a radiant smile, surrounded by a group of children. Her gaze was familiar, and a chill ran down Julio's spine as he realized one of the children in the photo was him. "What?" he murmured, unable to believe what he saw. At that moment, the door opened, and Anna walked in, bringing with her an aura of concern and pain. Seeing her son holding the photo, she stopped abruptly. "You found?" Anna said, her voice choked. "I didn't want you to see it like this. Why didn't you tell me?" Julio snapped, his voice a mix of indignation and confusion. "I assaulted her, Mum, and now I find out she's my grandmother. How could you keep this from me?" Anna sighed, the weight of the truth hanging heavily between them. I was afraid of your reaction. I knew you might feel torn, and the truth is, I didn't know how to handle it myself." Julio felt his blood boil. "Torn? Mom, you have no idea what I did. I hurt her." He gestured with his hands, frustration overflowing. "How can you expect me to just ignore this?" "I don't expect you to ignore it," Anna replied, her voice raised. "But you need to understand what's at stake. Maria is not just a stranger, she's a part of you. Her story is your story." Julio looked at the bed, where Maria lay deep in sleep. The weight of reality hit him hard. He could no longer see Maria merely as a victim, but also as a part of his own identity. He sat in the chair next to the bed, his mind racing, as Anna settled into the other. "Do you know what she went through?" Anna asked, softening her tone. "Sex, racism, discrimination, everything she faced. And now, you're a police officer. You're on the other end of the line." "I'm not like the others," Julio protested, but the conviction in his voice wavered. "I didn't want to hurt anyone." "I know, but you need to open your eyes, Julio." Anna touched her son's arm, seeking some form of connection. "Society is cruel, and often it's people like you who perpetuate that cruelty, even unintentionally." The words of Anna echoed in Julio's mind, and a new understanding began to take shape. He wasn't just battling his own prejudices, he was also fighting against a system that accepted brutality as the norm. He looked again at Maria, now more than just a victim, but a woman who fought and survived in a world that often silenced her. "I need to," Julio began, but his words trailed off. He didn't know where to start. Shame, pain, and confusion swirled within him, forming a whirlwind. "I need to understand more about her." Anna nodded, sensing her son's internal struggle. "Let's do this together, Julio. But you need to be willing to listen and learn. This could be the key to your redemption." And there, in that cold hospital room, a new path began to open for Julio. He knew the journey would be long and difficult, but the connection with Maria demanded that he confront his past and seek the truth, not just about her, but about himself. Anna sat in a circle, illuminated by soft lights in the small community room where the support group met. The smell of fresh coffee mingled in the air, and the murmur of voices enveloped the atmosphere with a sense of empathy and understanding. She looked around, observing the faces that shared their struggles, pains, and hopes. Although the meeting was meant to discuss racial issues and their implications, Anna felt that her internal battle was even more complex. "I don't know how to deal with this," Anna confessed, her voice trembling. "The truth about my family's history has always been hidden from me, and now I feel like everything is falling apart." A grey-haired woman, who introduced herself as Marlene, leaned forward, interested. "What did you discover?" she asked with an encouraging look. Anna took a deep breath and began to recount what had happened after Maria's assault. She spoke about the visit to the hospital, the moment she found the old photo, and the revelation that her mother, her real mother, had hidden it from her entire life. "Maria is my biological grandmother," Anna exclaimed, frustration and sadness evident in her tone. "I grew up believing we were a perfect family, but now I see that everything was built on a lie." The other group members listened attentively, and Anna could feel the connection forming with them. "You're not alone in this," said a young man named Lucas with a supportive look. "Many of us have faced family secrets that brought us pain, and that's what unites us, the search for truth and justice." Anna nodded, feeling a lightness in sharing her burden. The conversation flowed freely, and as the others shared their own stories of discrimination and struggle, she began to understand the depth of the impact that silence and denial can have on a family. Before we continue with this touching story, make sure to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any stories. And let us know which city you're watching this video from in the comments. After the meeting, Anna said goodbye to her new friends and walked home, her heart heavy, but her mind racing. She knew she needed to talk to Julio. He had to understand what was at stake, how Maria's story was intertwined with his own identity. That night, Ana lay awake, thinking about how to approach the subject. When the next day came, she decided she could no longer postpone it. As soon as Julio walked in the door, she called out to him. "Julio, we need to talk," she said, her tone serious. He turned to her, weariness etched on his face. He was still grappling with the confusion and discomfort of his recent actions. "What is it, Mum?" he asked, crossing his arms defensively. Ana hesitated, but knew she had to be direct. "It's about Maria, and about us," she began, feeling the weight of the conversation. "I went to the support group yesterday and learned some things we need to discuss." Julio's eyes narrowed. "What do you mean? What more could there be?" Distrust was evident in his voice. "Julio, Maria is your biological grandmother. I should have told you before, but I was scared. Scared of how you would react, scared of how this would affect our family," Ana said, her voice faltering slightly. The revelation hit Julio like a punch to the gut. He fell silent, absorbing the information. "This doesn't make sense. How could you hide this from me, Auntie?" he asked, his voice low but filled with indignation. "How could you not tell me that I have a grandmother who is suffering? I didn't know how—" Ana started, but Julio interrupted her. "It's not just that. I attacked her, Mom. I hurt her. How can you expect me to live with that?" Frustration and guilt overflowed in his words. Ana stepped closer to him, placing a hand on his shoulder, trying to convey comfort. "Julio, I'm dealing with this too. This is a story that connects us, that reveals not only what happened but who we are. We need to face this together." He looked away, struggling against the emotions bubbling inside him. "What do I do now? How can I fix this?" he said, vulnerability shining through in his voice. "We need to start understanding Maria's story, what she went through, and how it relates to you," Ana replied, determined. "You need to take responsibility for your actions and connect with your grandmother. It's the only way to move forward." The conversation stretched on, and Ana saw in Julio a fierce internal struggle, a battle between the man he was and the man he could become. The road ahead would be difficult, but she knew it was a necessary step for healing for all involved. Pedro Amaral sat at the table of the cafe near the precinct, a steaming cup of coffee in front of him. The strong aroma of coffee couldn't dissipate the storm of thoughts that plagued his mind. He looked out the window, watching pedestrians pass by, each with their own stories and struggles. The echo of police brutality he had witnessed still reverberated in his head, and the recent assault on Maria das Graças haunted him deeply. After all, who were they to decide who deserved respect and dignity? The cafe door opened, and Julio walked in, his face carrying an expression of disdain. Pedro felt a mix of anger and frustration upon seeing him there, as if his presence were poisoning the atmosphere. "What do you want, Julio?" Pedro asked, his voice tense. "I just wanted a coffee. I'm not here to fight," Julio replied defensively, while heading to the counter. "You can't just ignore what happened," Pedro confronted him, standing up from the table and approaching. "You acted like an animal, and now everything is on the brink of collapse because of it." Julio turned around, his expression shifting from disdain to irritation. "You don't understand. I was just doing my job, trying to control the situation. It wasn't supposed to be like this." "Control the situation?" Pedro exclaimed, frustration overflowing. "You used unnecessary force on an elderly woman. What did you expect? That she would just surrender to you like a criminal? Can't you see that this is part of the problem?" A heavy silence fell between them. Pedro felt the anger rising within him, while Julio appeared increasingly defensive. "Look, I'm not a monster. I just didn't know," Julio finally admitted, his voice quieter, almost broken. "Didn't know? Or didn't want to know?" Pedro asked, crossing his arms. "Have you forgotten that we all have stories? That everyone you approach has a life, a past, and isn't just a number in a statistic?" The tension between them was palpable, and Julio looked away, clearly struggling with his own demons. I don't know what to do, Pedro. My whole life I was taught to see things a certain way. Now everything is falling apart. So tell me, what is your truth? What do you really believe?" Pedro insisted, his voice softer now but still firm. "Are you willing to confront that, to disconnect from what you were taught and see reality?" Julio's expression was a mix of confusion and pain. He bit his lip, thinking. "I don't know if I can," he finally said. "I feel like I'd be betraying everything I've learned." "That's what it means to grow, Julio. That's what it means to be human. We all make mistakes, but we have to learn from them." Pedro replied, his tone now encouraging. "And you have a chance here. You can change this." Julio looked at the ground, the internal struggle evident in his eyes. "And what if I don't know how? What if I can't?" "You don't have to do it alone. You need to talk to your mom, to Maria. The truth about your story will help you understand who you really are." "That's what you need to do," Pedro said, his voice full of empathy. "It's not easy, but nothing worth it is." I'll try," Julio finally said, determination beginning to rise in his voice. "But what about you? What are you going to do?" "I'm going to investigate more about Maria. We need to understand deeply who she is, what she faced. This can help us see what's at stake here," Pedro replied, passion for justice burning in his heart. "And maybe along the way we can fix some things." Julio nodded slowly, feeling a new weight on his shoulders, but also a glimmer of hope. "Thank you, Pedro. I need this. We're in this together, man. We need to make it right," Pedro said, extending his hand to Julio. They looked at each other for a moment, and then slowly, Julio shook Pedro's hand, sealing a silent pact of change and solidarity. Maria woke up in a hospital room that, while welcoming, felt even colder due to the emptiness surrounding her. She looked around, recognizing the typical sounds of an intensive care unit, the constant beeping of machines, the distant murmur of conversations. The smell of disinfectant invaded her nostrils, but what truly troubled her was the feeling of helplessness that enveloped her. What should have been a moment of recovery was turning into an emotional battlefield. As soon as the nurse left, Maria struggled to sit up, still in pain but determined to regain her strength. She knew she needed to do more than just survive. It wasn't the first time she felt the pain of oppression. Her whole life had been marked by struggles and injustices. In that moment, she decided she wouldn't let violence silence her. In the following days, as she recovered, Maria began speaking at the local community center. She wanted to share her story, not just her own, but that of so many other black women who faced police brutality and discrimination. Her first speech was a shock to the community. The young people who listened were filled with anger and indignation, but also with hope. She had become a symbol of resistance, and they were ready to fight alongside her. "We need to unite. What happened to me can happen to any of you." "We can't allow violence to continue," Maria exclaimed, her voice strong and emotional. The audience, mostly made up of young activists, applauded, moving forward as if each of her words ignited a spark of courage within them. Among them was Lucas, a young man who had already participated in protests and stood out for his eloquence. He raised his hand and asked, "What can we do to help? What do you need from us?" Maria smiled, feeling warmth grow inside her. "We need more than protests. We need a movement that echoes our voices. We need to show that we're not just statistics. Each of you has a story, and together we can transform them into powerful force." The energy in the room was palpable. As the meeting ended, a small group of young people gathered around Maria, all excitedly discussing plans for a protest. The connection between them was instant, as if their shared experiences had created an unbreakable bond. Meanwhile, Julio watched everything on television from his living room. The news showed the demonstrations growing around the hospital, with signs and shouts of support for Maria. He felt divided in a sea of confusion and guilt. As a police officer, his first reaction was to feel threatened by the crowd, but at the same time, Maria's voice echoed in his mind, challenging him to see reality from her perspective. "You can't hide forever, Julio," whispered Ana, his adoptive mother, as she entered the room. "What you did was horrible, and you know it. It's time to face the consequences." "I know, Mom. I don't know how to deal with it. I can't understand what really happened," Julio replied, the words tumbling out in a whirlwind of emotions. Ana, with a heavy heart, sat beside him. "You need to go to her. Apologize. Not just to her, but to everyone you hurt that day. The community needs to see that you're willing to change." "And what if she doesn't forgive me?" Julio asked, insecurity showing in his voice. "You can't control her response, but you can control your actions," Ana replied with a firmness that made him reflect. "Change starts with you, Julio." Meanwhile, at the community center, the young people were in full swing organizing. "Let's hold a protest next Saturday. Maria will be our spokesperson. We need everyone mobilized," suggested Lucas, with a determination that inspired everyone around him. Maria looked at them, feeling a mix of gratitude and hope. "This fight is for all of us. It's not just about me, it's about the dignity of everyone who has suffered unjustly. Together we are stronger." The energy of the group was growing, and Maria knew that, for the first time in a long time, she was not alone. The community was uniting around her struggle, and the flame of resistance began to burn brightly. Flashes of memory began to unfold in Maria's mind like an old movie, where the frames overlapped, distorted by time and pain. She was in a small neighborhood, surrounded by simple houses, where the smell of fresh bread from the local bakery mixed with the aroma of the flowers her mother planted in the garden. Maria was a young girl full of dreams, with a wide smile and eyes that sparkled with hope. On a sunny afternoon, she met Alejandro, a light-skinned young man who enchanted her with his gentle demeanor and promises of a better future. "You are different from everyone else, Maria," Alejandro said, holding her hand delicately as they walked down the street. "I never thought I would find someone as special as you." She laughed, a laughter that echoed joyfully, oblivious to the world around them. "And you never thought you could love someone like me?" she asked with a hint of irony. "It doesn't matter the color of the skin. What matters is what's inside," he replied, looking deeply into her eyes. But reality would not take long to impose itself. When their love became known, the city reacted with hostility. Maria remembered the first time her mother found her with Alejandro. The look of disappointment and concern on her mother's face filled her with deep anguish. "My daughter, you don't understand the danger this brings. This love will not be accepted. People won't look at you the way I do." "But Mom, he loves me for real. He is different." Maria tried to argue, but her voice trembled, knowing that her mother's resistance came from a place of protection. As the months passed, things worsened. Maria faced disdainful looks and cruel words in the streets. One fateful night, what should have been a romantic encounter turned into a nightmare. A group of men, driven by prejudice and rage, surrounded them. "Look who we have here. A little black girl thinking she's special," shouted one of the men while others laughed. Alejandro tried to protect Maria, stepping in front of her. "Stay out of this, just go away," he pleaded, but his voice was a whisper amidst the clamor of hostility. Maria remembered the struggle, the despair, and the moment she had to choose between love and the safety of her daughter, who was on the way. Fear took hold of her, and the return home became a race against time. Later, when she found a safe place, she made a promise to herself. "I won't let anger and hatred define me," she murmured, as she looked at her reflection in the fogged glass of a window. "I am stronger than this. I will fight for my daughter and for my dignity." This inner strength was what sustained her now, as she found herself vulnerable in a hospital bed, surrounded by a harsh and cold reality. When she finally awoke, the environment around her was a mix of voices and machines. Pain throbbed in her body, but her mind was clear. She could not forget. It was a weight she carried, the struggle of a woman who had become a symbol of resistance. Julio, the man who had assaulted her, was on her mind. He represented not only the brutality of the police, but also the reflection of a society that had yet to learn to look beyond appearances. "Why did you do this?" she whispered, not to him, but to the emptiness of the room. "You don't know who I am. You don't know the struggle I've faced." She took a deep breath, feeling that even in her fragility, there was a fire inside her that could not be extinguished. Now more than ever, she was ready to rise, to fight for her truth and for the truth of so many other women who had suffered in silence. The weight of the past pressed down on her shoulders, but she was determined to turn it into strength. "I am not just a victim," she said, feeling stronger with each word. "I am a survivor, and my voice will be heard." The tension in the police station was palpable. Julio was leaning against his desk, his eyes lost in some distant point, as frustration built up inside him like a storm about to burst. The image of Maria, his biological grandmother, with her gaze filled with pain and disappointment, would not leave his mind. He knew he was wrong, but pride and the defense of his role as a police officer prevented him from taking the first step toward redemption. Pedro, on the other hand, approached Julio's desk with firm steps. He had seen enough of it all. Every day, his indignation about the treatment the black community received at the hands of the police grew. He had seen the video of the assault, and every time he replayed it, his anger increased. Pedro stopped in front of Julio's desk, his eyes filled with determination. "We need to talk, Julio," he said, his voice low but firm. Julio lifted his head, his eyes filled with resistance. "About what? What more do you want from me, Pedro? Do you think I don't know I was an idiot? I'm dealing with this in my own way." "Your way?" Pedro crossed his arms, his tone rising. "You don't understand that it's not just about you? You acted as if Maria were not a person but an animal to be controlled. You can't just ignore that." Julio stood up, now face to face with Pedro. "I'm not ignoring anything. I'm a police officer. I do what it takes to maintain order. Order! Pedro nearly shouted, drawing the attention of several colleagues who turned to watch the scene. You call that order? What happened to Maria was brutality. A testament to what is wrong with this system. You need to see that. Julio took a deep breath, trying to stay calm. He knew Pedro was right, but his colleague's words stung. And what do you want me to do? Apologize? I don't even know where to start to fix this. Start by taking responsibility, Julio. Pedro gestured, frustration overflowing. Hiding behind your badge won't help. You need to face the consequences of your actions. The tension between them was rising, and Julio, in a sudden impulse, pushed his chair back, making a loud noise that echoed through the room. He turned to look out the window. The city pulsed, and he knew he was at the center of a storm. The anger and pain of Maria, his grandmother's struggle, and the weight of his own identity were all converging into a single point of pressure. What if I can't do it? Julio murmured, almost to himself. Pedro took a step forward, his voice softer now. You can do it, but you need to want it. It's not just about you, Julio. It's about Maria, about the community, and about everyone who has suffered because of actions like yours. I'm not a monster, Julio shouted, emotions spilling over. I never meant to hurt her, but you did hurt her, and now you need to do something about it. Pedro said, his gaze intense. You need to join us, ally yourself with the fight. It's not too late to change. The tension was almost unbearable, and Julio felt torn. He wanted to scream, to defend himself, but deep down he knew Pedro was right. He had failed, and that failure couldn't be ignored. Regret began to mix with anger, and the internal struggle was almost physical. What would you do in my place? Julio asked, his voice low. I would look within myself. I would acknowledge my mistake and do whatever is necessary to correct it. And more importantly, I would listen to the voices that have been silenced. Pedro replied, the sincerity in his tone undeniable. Julio closed his eyes, the battle within him fierce. He knew he was at a turning point. What he chose from there could not only change his destiny, but also that of Maria and many others. And that was what terrified him the most. Julio took a deep breath before entering the hospital room. The smell of disinfectant and the cold light of fluorescent bulbs contrasted with the turmoil unfolding in his mind. He felt like an intruder in that space, a man who had stripped away the dignity of a woman now fighting to recover. Maria, his biological grandmother, lay in bed, surrounded by tubes and monitors, and the thought that the woman there could be family consumed him with anguish. He hesitated at the door, remembering the brutality with which he had confronted her. The images of her face, twisted with pain and resistance, haunted him. She doesn't deserve this, he thought, but doubt and fear still dominated him. When he finally entered, Maria opened her eyes slowly, as if the hospital light was a burden. She recognized him, but said nothing. The silence between them was laden with meaning, an unspoken conversation echoing in every corner of the room. Maria, Julio began, but the words failed him. He wanted to apologize, to explain that he wasn't who he had become, but her presence, firm and full of history, made him feel small. She looked at him with a gaze that mixed pain and distrust. He could almost hear the echoes of a lifetime of resistance and struggle against racism, and all he could do was feel ashamed. You can't call me grandmother, not after what you've done, she said, her voice cracked and firm. You have no idea what it means to be a black woman in this country, nor what I've endured to protect my family. Julio felt the pressure grow in his chest. I know I made a mistake, and I'm so sorry for what happened. I never wanted to hurt you. I never wanted to? Is that your answer? You didn't want to? You need to understand that your actions have consequences, not just for you, but for everyone around you, Maria interrupted, her voice rising. I'm not just a victim. I'm a survivor, and you need to see that. He looked at her, and for the first time he saw beyond the grandmother he didn't know. He saw a woman who had faced a lifetime of pain and discrimination, who had fought for every step she took. I'm not like this. I don't want to be this cop. I don't want to be this man, he said, emotion overflowing. Maria turned to the window, watching the city move. You can't change what happened, Julio, but you can change how you live from here on out. Your fight isn't just against violence. It's against the prejudice that exists within you, she emphasized. He swallowed hard, feeling each of her words hit him like a blow. How can I do this? How can I redeem myself? Start by listening. Start by understanding. Your story isn't the only one that matters, she said, turning her gaze back to him. You need to connect with your truth, with who you are. It's not just about you, it's about us, about the community, about what we are as people. Julio felt tears threatening to spill down his face. I don't know if I can. I don't know if I'll be able to carry this weight, he confessed, his voice trembling. We all carry a weight, Julio. Yours is guilt, mine is struggle, but together we can find a way. You need to decide which side you're on, and that starts now, Maria replied, her voice now softer but firm. The conversation stretched on, filled with revelations and questions, and Julio began to understand that the connection between them wasn't just blood, but also experience and resilience. Maria's words penetrated his soul, forcing him to confront not just his actions, but his beliefs. As he stood to leave, a new understanding formed in his mind. He wasn't just leaving the hospital, he was leaving behind an old self, a man who had lost his way. As he walked out the door, the last thing he heard was Maria saying, "Remember, the truth is heavy, but it's the only thing that can set us free." And upon hearing those words, he knew the journey was just beginning. The sun began to set over the metropolis, painting the sky orange and purple, as a crowd gathered in front of the police station. The atmosphere was charged with tension and expectation, and the crowd murmured in unison, awaiting the outcome of the story that had taken over the headlines. Among them stood a woman with grey hair and a firm expression, Maria, preparing to be the voice of resistance. The indignation burning in her eyes was not just for the violence she had suffered, but also for the injustice that spread like a shadow over her community. Inside the police station, Julio felt his heart race, the pressure in his chest mounting with each passing minute. He watched the computer screen, where images of his assault on Maria were being shared across the country. The clamor for justice reverberated in every corner of the city, and the pressure on the police department could not have been more evident. As soon as the video went public, indignation took over the streets that had once been a silent stage of discrimination and pain. The phone rang, breaking his reverie. "Captain, we have a situation outside," a colleague said, his voice tense. "The protesters are organizing. They want you to speak." Julio took a deep breath, feeling the weight of responsibility on his shoulders. "We're dealing with a delicate situation. We need to keep calm," he replied, trying to hide his unease. But the truth was, what he needed most was an escape. Part of him wanted to hide, but another part knew he couldn't escape the consequences of his actions. Meanwhile, Maria, now fully recovered, stood in front of the crowd, holding a megaphone. Her gaze fixed on the horizon where the sun was setting, her firm voice echoed, "Today we are here not only for me, but for all the lives affected by brutality and oppression. We will not be silenced." The crowd erupted in applause, and the energy was contagious. Maria's words became a call to action, a summons for justice that resonated within the souls of those who listened. The scene at the precinct was about to escalate. In a moment of impulse, Julio decided to step out to face the crowd. He knew he could no longer hide behind his uniform. As he opened the door, he was met with shouts and jeers. "Out! Out! Out!" echoed like a mantra. He raised his hands in a gesture of surrender, but there was no denying the truth of what he had done. "Maria!" he shouted, trying to catch her gaze in the crowd. I need to talk to you." Maria turned, her eyes filled with pain and anger. "What do you have to say, Julio? That you're just another cop hiding behind your badge? That you take pride in controlling a situation that was, in fact, an abuse of power?" Silence fell for a brief moment as the crowd awaited Julio's response. He felt each word hit him like a blow. I didn't know you were my grandmother. I didn't know what I was doing." His voice trembled. "I want to understand. I want to apologize. I want to be better." Maria shook her head in disdain. "Apologies aren't enough, Julio. You can't just erase the pain you caused. You need to face the consequences of your actions, and the truth is, you're not just a cop. You are part of the problem." Her words cut like a knife, and Julio felt guilt and regret mix in his chest. What he had done could not be undone. "I want to make this right. I want to fight by your side. If you'll let me," he pleaded, his voice almost a whisper. At that moment, one of the protesters raised his cell phone. "Look, the video of the assault is already circulating on social media. The pressure is mounting and the police are being called to respond," he announced, and the crowd erupted in supportive shouts. Maria looked at Julio once more, and he saw a spark of determination in her eyes. She turned to the crowd and, with the strength of a leader, declared, "Today we demand justice. We demand that our voices be heard. Julio, if you truly want to change, then show it to the world." Maria's words echoed in Julio's mind as he prepared for what was to come. He knew that no matter what happened, the truth was finally being revealed, and it was time to face what it really meant to be part of the change. The courtroom was packed, and the tension in the air was palpable. Maria, standing in front of the judge, felt the weight of every gaze directed at her. The room, filled with murmurs and whispers, fell silent as she began to testify. Her voice, though trembling, carried the weight of her story. "The assault I suffered was not just physical," she began, her gaze steady. "It resonated in my life, in the lives of my children and grandchildren. I fought my whole life for my family to have dignity, and that day was a blow that made me question my worth." Julio, sitting next to his lawyer, felt his heart tighten with every word that left the lips of the woman he had hurt. He looked down, trying to hide from the truth that enveloped her. Maria continued, her voice growing in intensity. "Julio, you didn't just assault me. You stripped away the dignity I had fought so hard to regain. You made me feel like I was nothing, and for a woman who has faced so much, that is devastating." The judge, a middle-aged man with a serious demeanor, listened intently. He knew Maria's story was part of a much larger context, a narrative intertwined with the struggles of a community. "Do you remember what happened that day, Julio?" The defense attorney asked the question, but it was clear that the answer was something he had replayed in his mind countless times. The entire room was waiting. "Yes," Julio replied, his voice low. I used unnecessary force. I thought I was doing my job, but I realize now that I was just perpetuating violence." The sincerity of his words caused a murmur among the rows of spectators. He turned to Maria, his gaze filled with regret. "Maria, I'm so sorry. I can't change what I did, but I'm grateful you're still here, for having the courage to speak." Maria took a deep breath, feeling pain and anger mix inside her. "You can apologize to me, Julio, but that doesn't erase what happened. What I want is for you to understand your responsibility, not just as a man, but as a police officer. You have the power to change things, to be part of the solution instead of part of the problem." Julio's attorney, sensing the depth of the moment, decided to step in. "What are you willing to do, Julio? Are you willing to commit to this change?" Julio looked around, his heart heavy. I want to work alongside Maria, Pedro, and the community. I want to learn. I want to understand. I want to be part of the change we need, not just for me, but for all of us." The words came out like a cry of desperation, but also of hope. The judge, impressed, noted something in his notebook. After a long silence, the judge stood. "Considering the gravity of the situation and Julio's words, I decide that a mere punishment will not suffice. Julio Medeiros, you will be sentenced to a community service program focused on racial justice and rehabilitation. I hope you learn from this and become a positive agent of change." The room erupted in murmurs, some people applauding, others expressing discontent. Maria turned to Julio, a mix of anger and understanding in her gaze. "You will have the chance to redeem yourself, Julio. Use it wisely." As Julio left the courtroom, he felt a new chapter opening before him. He approached Maria and Pedro, who were waiting outside. "I want to work with you. I want to listen. I want to learn." Pedro, who had been one of Julio's harshest critics, looked into his eyes, sensing sincerity. "Let's do this together. The change won't be easy, but we need to start. We will fight for justice and dignity, and I hope you're ready for that." Maria, with a light smile, added, "We're all in this together. The weight of truth is heavy, but it's necessary. Let's move forward, one step at a time." And so, despite the scars of the past, they united in a common struggle, ready to face the challenges ahead, determined to turn pain into action and injustice into hope. We've reached the end of this moving story. If you enjoyed it and want to see more tales like this, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell. Right now there's a playlist of videos on your screen. If you want to keep watching these touching stories, just click on it and you'll start watching right away. Now, tell us in the comments which city you're watching from and leave a like to support our work. And here's a sincere question. Do you agree with what happened in the story? We want to know your opinion. Until the next video.